Happy St. Patrick's Day. Because of the occasion, it happens to line up with our regular Tuesday this year. We thought, well, let's look at St. Patrick, and then also maybe more broadly, as St. Patrick is understood anyway to be the founder or the apostle to Ireland, the founder of Irish Christianity, what some of the legacy of that is. So when I think of St. Patrick's Day, one of the main images I always think of is people in Chicago, for some reason, dyeing their river green, which looks very interesting, but doesn't look very, I don't know, natural or healthy, and yet it's too much fun, I guess, not to do it. It's a tradition that goes on every year and has become really popular, along with all kinds of other St. Patrick's Day traditions, like wearing green, and I guess when you're a student anyway, a kid, pinching people who are not wearing green, going to parades. We had a parade here in Toronto on Sunday that Leandra and I went and saw. Drinking green beer, eating distinctive Irish foods, and more or less all things Irish. So this is one of the saints' days in the traditional Christian calendar. So every single day of the year actually has at least one saint assigned to it. But the reality is that very few of these have survived and evolved into being major secular holidays, at least in North America. So in addition to St. Patrick's Day, we of course have St. Valentine's Day, which I kind of think of as mostly a Hallmark card holiday, but it is got some other, some proponents and customs to it, going out to dinner and so forth. And of course, the eve of All Saints' Day, Halloween, has become a really big holiday, but most of the other ones, you probably don't know when St. Peter's Day is, or any of the other saints' days in the Christian calendar. Part of the reason for that is that the holiday became popularized in the vast Irish diaspora. And so even though the combined population of the Republic of Ireland and the Northern Ireland component of the UK, in other words, the population of the island of Ireland is maybe around 7 million today, over the course of the last several centuries, more people than that, 10 million people have immigrated away from Ireland to other places. And so you can see kind of in green here the various places where Irish people live. And certainly in the United States and Canada, there are tens of millions of people who claim Irish descent to some degree or another. So some 80 million people around the world claim Irish descent. And so, for example, in the United States, St. Patrick's Day became sort of a time when people in the Irish diaspora sort of got together as their ethnic cultural holiday and then spread that in the same way that Columbus Day was not originally intended as a topic about the New World or the natives, the Columbian discovery, interaction, all that kind of thing. But it's actually about the Italian diaspora population of the United States, a kind of an ethnic holiday on the same grounds, but that one has become more complicated because of, the reevaluation of the Columbian exchange or the European colonial era and so forth. St. Patrick has some of the same kind of problems or different problems because it is also the identity got mixed up with nationalism, and so it becomes once you start to take a historical figure or historical events and you start to pull them together into kind of a national identity myth, that also distorts the lens through which you're seeing the figure. So Patrick's Saint's Day is on March 17th, the day today, which is traditionally the date of his death. That's what a lot of times when a saint's day will be, when they're putting a saint's day on the calendar, essentially because as opposed to their birthday, when they die, that's the time when they're coming into God's presence in heaven. And so because that takes place in Lent, usually, unless Easter's already come that early. I don't know if it can come quite that early, but anyway, it's normally right now it's Lent. Lent traditionally is a time when you are restricting your diet, alcohol consumption, not supposed to eat certain foods and so on. And so March 17th was one of the days that gave you a reprieve from regular Lenten restrictions, which gives the holiday some of its associations with revelry. Patrick is the patron saint of Ireland, and so he's traditionally credited with bringing Christianity to Ireland, and so one of his titles is the Apostle of Ireland. And he's famous for all sorts of traditional things, including, I think, maybe most famously, the idea that he magically drove all the snakes away from Ireland. So banishing the snakes. Great Britain, the island next door to Ireland, actually has snakes. There are 3 native species of snake. The adder, which is the only native poisonous snake, the grass snake, and a much more rare smooth snake, apparently. Ireland, by contrast, is famously free of snakes to this day. There are no, I guess even I looked it up, there's no invasive species of snake. It seems like people get tempted to bring a couple snakes. But anyway, they haven't been able to successfully get any in there and loose them in the wild, unlike all of the invasive species in other places around the world. A 12th century English Cistercian monk who was a hagiographer, that is to say, somebody who writes not quite biographies, but rather lives of various saints, wrote a life of St. Patrick. And this records the fact that the saint miraculously cast all the snakes away from the island when they disturbed a special fast that he was having. So he was in this having a fast, he's meditating, communing with God. The snakes are disturbing him, and so he curses them and casts them all out to the sea. And so there have never been any snakes in Ireland ever since then. Unfortunately, that 12th century text, that's the earliest association with St. Patrick and the snakes. But we do have written some 500 years earlier, a guy named Adamnan of Iona, an Irish monk actually, who wrote a life of St. Columba. And that saint's life indicates that it's Columba who was the Christian miracle worker who drove all the snakes from Ireland. So Columba is actually an Irish abbot who has the title Apostle of the Picts because he led the first mission to evangelize the northern Pictish kingdoms, bringing them to Christianity. So predating either of those sources is a work by Gaius Julius Solinus. So Solinus was a 3rd century Latin grammarian, not a Christian, someone who followed the old gods, and he wrote a popular book on the wonders of the world, and a excerpt of that circulated under the title A Collection of Curious Things or Marvelous Things. So kind of thing that was really popular, like a Ripley's Believe It or Not kind of thing, in where he's taking things, if you remember all of the, all of the fables about unicorns and so on that are in books like Pliny the Elder, which is just, Pliny loved every kind of wondrous, crazy thing that he ever heard of from any legend that he found, and he put that together into his big book. Well, Solinus took out the best of those and made a popular book that continued to be circulating all through the Middle Ages. So although Ireland, Hibernia, was outside the Roman Empire, Solinus made note of the fact that Ireland was free of snakes already in the 3rd century, that is to say, before either St. Columba or St. Patrick got there or was alive or anything like that. So in other words, before any Christians arrived in Ireland, there were no snakes. So it turns out there never were any snakes. So in the Ice Age, glaciers and a big ice sheet had covered much of the British Isles, including all of Ireland. And when the glaciers retreated, snakes did not come back to the island and repopulate it. But the story has always been too good not to retell again and again since the Middle Ages. As apostle to Ireland, one of the things that Patrick was tasked with was explaining the complicated concept of the Trinity to people who were used to a much simpler idea of the gods. So very famously, and see like in the stained glass windows here, Patrick is said to make use of a shamrock, the three-leaf clover, which is still one of the main symbols you'll see decorating all of the St. Patrick's Day floats and everything like that, shamrocks, to teach the idea of the Trinity, one God in three persons. And as I say, these three-leaf clovers continue to be a symbol of St. Patrick's Day, and Ireland all the way down to the day. So the story of Patrick converting Irish pagans is told in a pretty funny YouTube channel called Lutheran Satire. And St. Patrick is trying to convert these two Irishmen who are having trouble understanding the idea of the Trinity. Patrick explains, well, look, there are three persons in the Trinity. There's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and yet there is only one God. So, okay, well, how does that work? So the Irishmen say, well, can you give us an analogy? So like I say, the analogy famously associated with St. Patrick is the shamrock. So it's a single plant, it has three leaves, but in using that to describe the Trinity, there are a couple of problems, as the channel points out. So one of the Irish guys says, I'm going to stop you right there, Patrick. You're about to confess partialism, which is a heresy that asserts that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are not distinct persons of the Godhead, but are simply different parts of God. So while the leaves of a shamrock are three in number, they can't be an analogy for the Trinity, since each of those three leaves is not the shamrock. The shamrock is all of them together. So each of the leaves is merely a part of the shamrock, a third of the shamrock. So by contrast, in the theological idea of the Trinity, each distinct person is God. So Christ is God. The Heavenly Parent is God. The Holy Spirit is God, but then Christ is not the parent, not the Spirit, and so forth. So, as difficult as it is to avoid falling into heresy when talking for any length of time about the Trinity, as we always point out, there is actually no reason to imagine Patrick was guilty of partialism any more than we should imagine that he actually drove the snakes out. The earliest literary reference to Patrick using the shamrock to explain the Trinity, it dates all the way to the 18th century. So even much later than the snake stuff, so 700 years after that. And so that makes the story a modern invention, probably a modern error from modern people who understand the Trinity even less well than early medieval, late antique people did. So in addition to not driving out the snakes, not teaching the Trinity using a shamrock, there's actually evidence, and actually Christianity certainly existed before Patrick had a mission to Ireland, unless we can't exactly date him. So unless he is dated way earlier, then most historians will date him. And so perhaps then, if all you've, we don't normally debunk here, and I'm not meaning to, we're going to tell, actually what we want to do is tell all of the interesting things, but if your only association with St. Patrick is through the sort of, as a symbol of national identity through the Irish nationalism myth, then the one last detail about Patrick that might be hard to swallow is that he's not Irish. Obviously, he's British. If you're going to be the apostle to Ireland, you have to be from somewhere else. So in the same way that we saw here that Columba, who is Irish, he's the apostle to the Picts. He can't be from Pictland because he's got to come from somewhere where he's bringing Christianity to. Similarly, the apostle to the English, to the Anglo-Saxons, a guy who is known as Augustine of Canterbury to differentiate him from the more famous St. Augustine of Hippo. Augustine of Canterbury was from Italy, so the apostle to the English is Italian. And so the apostle to the Irish had to be from somewhere, and so he's from, it turns out, Great Britain. So, looking here at what, at the time anyway, in the Roman Empire, how they would have understand the British Isles, Ireland and Great Britain and the other islands, at the very edge of the world as the Romans understood it. And you can sort of see here, Ireland is up the upper left, and Great Britain is the larger island there. You can see that they were aware of the kind of the point that comes off at what becomes known as Cornwall. And you can kind of see what's now Wales kind of sticking out. And then they had in the Ptolemaic, Claudius Ptolemy's geography here, they have what's now Scotland, Caledonia, Pictland, and so forth, but they have it kind of going off in the east, northeast, as opposed to more north the way it actually is. So while the Romans conquered Britain south of Hadrian's Wall or the Antonine Wall when they were up to that level, the area north of the wall, what we now think of as Scotland, Pictland, and so forth, and then the area of Ireland, Hibernia, they were never incorporated into the empire. So the Romans knew about them and had some trading contact with them and so forth. But in both cases, Ireland and the area of Britain north of Hadrian's Wall weren't economically viable enough on the Roman model to be able to be worth the expense of conquering them. So the Roman system more or less required significant agricultural lands that could be the center of cities. Roman civilization, uses the word there, civitas, means city. So city is a center of how Romans understood everything. And the Roman economy was all about essentially incorporating regions of territory with a city at the heart of them, where the city is more or less drawing all of the economic resources of its territory to itself, including populations, because the cities also didn't self-reproduce. They were relatively unhealthy. People would die in them, and they had fewer children, and so actually there was a continual flow from the countryside into the cities, which served as administrative centers and centers of taxation and economy and so forth, as central to the Roman system. And so the agricultural lands, according to Roman agricultural techniques, north, into Scotland, what's now Scotland and Ireland, was not as viable enough to conquer either one of them. Nevertheless, the peoples of those places were very aware of the Romans and the Roman Britons. So let's put Patrick's life in we can't date it precisely, but in the 5th century when he's around, into kind of the broader context, which is this really interesting time during the collapse of Western imperial authority. What we sometimes call the fall of the Roman Empire, although we've had whole lectures where we asked, did Rome really fall? Some of the elements that were essential to Romanitas, of what it meant to be Roman, continued to survive for centuries and centuries afterwards, although some of the central things about what it meant to be a Roman, including especially the central autocracy, the emperor himself, the emperor's court, the imperial army, that all did collapse. And especially then what happened was, in place of what had been a unified state army, there were individual mercenary armies that were led by Germanic kings, people who were kings of large Germanic confederations, who then took over the military function, the administrative function, taxation, and so forth. Although underneath them, many of the continuing forms continue to exist of the Roman provincial system, the Roman city system, and especially the Roman state religion system that had emerged through the 4th century and now into the 5th century. And so Patrick is from kind of the extreme edge of this, up in what had been Roman Britain, a place where as recently as someone like the Emperor Constantine could have been born, grown up as a regular Roman, speaking Latin, ultimately becoming the sole emperor and so on. Now, where Patrick is, this has become way kind of fringe, in a way that's essentially impassable to get to Constantine's capital in Constantinople, essentially anymore. So under existential pressures on the continent, as confederations like the Huns came off of the steppes into the Germanic lands, put incredible pressures on the Germanic confederations who crossed the frontiers and entered into the Roman lands themselves. The West Roman government withdrew its legions from Britain, where they had been manning Hadrian's Wall and so forth. And ultimately, the Emperor Honorius in the year 410 sent a rescript or a letter to the Romano-Britons, look after your own defenses. We're not going to be able to help you out anymore. That led them to sort of essentially declare independence themselves and look to their own defenses. And the Romano-Britons in the province, as they kind of contracted into what we now think of as England as part of Britain, are then raided from all sides, as the Irish raid from Ireland, the Picts raid down from what we now think of as Scotland, and the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes come from where we now think of as the lowlands and Germany and Denmark, and begin to conquer and invade and also settle what had been Roman Britain. So this is the kind of period of time when all this chaos is happening that Patrick is around. So how can we find out about Patrick? Well, whenever we're looking at saints from late antiquity, from the early Middle Ages, one of our main sources is a hagiography. So early Christians developed this genre of literature. It's not a biography, really. It's a saint's life, a hagiography, and they're written usually very many decades after the death of the individual. They are written in order to talk about how holy the person is, to talk about their amazing capacities to endure hardships. And the longer they're written after the person's death and the more legends have grown up around them, they're usually filled with all sorts of stories of miraculous activities that the saint does. And so, for example, St. Nicholas, who has had a modern revival as Santa Claus, was an early saint that's just credited with all sorts of miraculous events that he did, including saving sailors a lot. And so, for example, walking on water and so forth in order to save sailors, which is why he becomes, in addition to being the patron of children and other people, he's also, I think, merchants. He's also the patron of sailors and other things. So we talked about this 12th century life of St. Patrick, so that's one of these hagiographies. So this Cistercian monk, Jocelyn of Furness, as we said, he's the earliest author who is the source of connecting St. Patrick to driving the snakes out of Ireland. But his life of St. Patrick includes all sorts of other incredible, miraculous things, including raising 33 different people from the dead, some of them after they've been dead for many years, including his own foster father. He transmutes, he's having a big fight with another wizard or a pagan wizard, and he transmutes stone into curdled milk, and then he transmutes it back into stone to show God's power. He turns a wolf into a lamb, all sorts of other miraculous things, showing incredible divine power. So normally, when we only have a hagiography, like for example, we don't have too much on the historical St. Nicholas, and it's very then difficult to tease out actual biographical details of a historical figure when you're working from a hagiography only. But remarkably, in the case of Patrick, we actually have 2 documents attributed to him, so things that he wrote himself, and almost all scholars agree that they're authentic. And so that gives us a much more incredible window into the actual personage. So these are the declaration, or Latin that's confessio, confession of St. Patrick. And then we have St. Patrick's letter to Coroticus, or to the Soldiers of Coroticus. So the letter to Coroticus, the Epistola ad Coroticum, in that Patrick describes himself as he's writing to Coroticus. He says, I, Patrick, a sinner, unlearned, resident in Ireland, declare myself to be a bishop. Most assuredly, I believe what I am, I have received from God. And so I live among barbarians, a stranger and exile for the love of God. He is witness that this is so. Not that I'd wished my mouth to utter anything so hard and harsh, but I am forced by the zeal for God, and the truth of Christ has wrung it from me, out of love for my neighbors and sons, for whom I gave up my country and parents and my life to the point of death. If I be worthy, if I live for my God, to teach the heathen, even though some may despise me. So Patrick is reminding us here that not only is he not from this country, he considers the people here to be barbarians and heathens and so forth, and many of them hate him for it. Anyway, with my own hand I have written and composed these words to be given, delivered, and sent to the soldiers of Coroticus. I do not say to my fellow citizens or to fellow citizens of the Holy Romans, but to fellow citizens of the demons because of their evil works. Like our enemies, they live in death, they're allies of the Scots and the apostate Picts. Dripping with blood, they welter in the blood of innocent Christians, whom I have begotten into the number of God and confirmed in Christ. So Patrick here, as he's writing to the soldiers of Coroticus, he doesn't want to call them fellow citizens, but what he's meaning here is, he's not saying that they're fellow Romans because he doesn't think they're acting like Romans. So Patrick himself, he's identifying himself as a Roman among the barbarians. He's writing to Coroticus, who seems to be a Romano-British warlord, but he's saying, I don't want to call you a Roman because of how terrible you're behaving. So a warlord active in Ireland. Interestingly, as we're reading that, Patrick self-identifies as a bishop. He says, I declare myself to be a bishop. And he also cites as a divine calling from God his bishopric, his episcopacy. Just like Paul claimed to be an apostle, but doesn't really have any human who ordained him an apostle, he was called directly from God. And so Patrick, in this letter, doesn't, for example, give the name of a bishop who ordains him, but instead says, I know that's what I've been called to from God. So as he's writing Coroticus, the context of this letter seems to be that Coroticus is a British Roman warlord who is in Ireland and who raided a major gathering of Christians during a big festival while they were being baptized. So Patrick has baptized all of them and has confirmed them, and they're still wearing their white baptismal robes and everything like that. But they are then attacked by Coroticus's raiders. And so Patrick says, I don't know what to lament more. Those who have been slain, those whom they have taken captive, or those whom the devil has mightily ensnared. So some of them maybe have gone over and joined the camp, some have been taken captive, and some are slain. All of these are terrible ends. Coroticus and his men have killed a number of these newly baptized Irish converts. They've sold others into slavery, and Patrick laments. The church mourns and laments her sons and daughters, whom the sword has not yet slain, but who were removed and carried off to faraway lands, where sin abounds openly, grossly, and impudently. There, people who were born free have been sold, Christians have been made slaves, and that too in the service of the abominable and wicked apostate Picts. So Coroticus has taken some of these captives off and enslaved them and sold them to the Picts and what we now think of as Scotland. Patrick contrasts what Coroticus has done by killing and enslaving Christians in Ireland with the practice of the Franks on the continent. He says this is the custom of the Roman Christians of Gaul, what we now think of as France. They send holy and able men to the Franks and other heathen with so many thousand solidi to ransom baptized captives. You, though, Coroticus, prefer to kill and sell them to a foreign nation that has no knowledge of God. So this contemporary example of Gallo-Roman Christians ransoming prisoners back from the Franks implies, he's saying Franks and other heathen. So that implies that this is before, Patrick is writing sometime before the Franks themselves convert to Christianity in 496. So earlier in the 5th century is what this is dated to. So, that said, if Patrick and the Irish Christians had, gold solidi, these are the big late Roman coins, gold coins, that they don't have those in Ireland. So if they had those to ransom captured Christians, Coroticus and his men, he certainly would have wanted to trade gold for prisoners, or they would have tried to steal the gold and not have to give up the prisoners. But in any event, since Patrick doesn't have any gold like that, he can only attempt to use his spiritual powers to get the captives back. So in other words, guilt and fear of hellfire. So he says, where then will Coroticus and his criminals, rebels against Christ, where will they see themselves, they who distribute baptized women as prizes, for some miserable temporal kingdom which will pass away in a moment. So they're having their rotten worldly thing that they're doing, and what are you going to do on earth? That's going to pass away. As a cloud or smoke that is dispersed in the wind, so shall the deceitful wicked perish at the presence of the Lord. But the just shall feast with great constancy with Christ, and they shall judge nations and rule over wicked kings forever and ever. Amen. So Patrick ends this letter by calling for people to read it in the presence of Coroticus and his soldiers. So he says at the end of his letter, I ask earnestly that whoever is a willing servant of God be a carrier of this letter, so that on no account it be suppressed or hidden by anybody, but rather be read before all the people and in the presence of Coroticus himself. May God inspire them sometime to recover their senses for God, repenting however late their heinous deeds, murderers of the brethren of the Lord, and to set free the baptized women whom they took captive, in order that they may deserve to live to God and be made whole here and in eternity. Be peace to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Amen. So this is an interesting letter. And I think Paul's epistle here to Coroticus illustrates really the precarious situation of life in the British Isles after the withdrawal of Roman authority. So Romano-British warlords, along with Scots, Picts, and other raiders, are attacking settlements for one of the few remaining valuable commodities in the islands, people themselves who are then being enslaved and sold into bondage. So we learn more details about Patrick's life story from his declaration, which is, the Latin word is confessio, so sometimes we say the confession of St. Patrick. So while Patrick is writing the text in his old age, he's telling the story, looking back decades into the past, beginning with his life as a teenager. And so the Confessio begins, I, Patrick, a sinner, the most rustic and the least of all the faithful, and utterly despised by many. My father was Calpurnius, a deacon, the son of Palladius, a priest of the village of Benavim, Taburnia. My father had a country seat nearby, a villa, and there I was taken captive. I was then about 16 years of age. I did not know the true God. I was taken into captivity to Ireland with many thousands of people, and deservedly so, because we had turned away from God and did not keep his commandments. We did not obey our priests, who used to remind us of our salvation. So there's only 2 documents here by Patrick, and this is a second example, 2 out of 2, where we have raiders attacking villages and other places in order to seize and enslave people. And so in this case, what we have are Irish raiders seizing Romano-British people. So this town that Patrick talks about, village that he's from, Benawim, Taburnia, that hasn't been positively identified. So it's just a little tiny place, presumably, and there are multiple candidates that people have proposed for it, so we can't really know, somewhere in Britain. So Patrick's father here, Calpurnius, his grandfather, Palladius, are ordained. So they're a deacon and a priest, respectively, and anybody who is ordained clergy in late antiquity like this, the very early Middle Ages, especially north of the Alps, it's a very rare phenomenon. So these would be kind of part of the provincial church elite. And also in the letter, he identifies his father, Calpurnius, as a decurion. So the decurion class are the local civic officials that the Roman Empire relied on in order to lead all of that local civic administration. I was saying how essentially the empire is set around different cities and towns. And the decurions are the people that are running those towns for the empire. So the empire itself, what we think of like the federal government, the main government, the imperial government, is the emperor himself and his court, and the army, and then provincial governors. But then within all the towns and cities, we have this lower than the senatorial elite class, we have this local elite class of the decurions. So despite his family's status in the church, as Patrick says here, he considered himself to have been kind of a rebellious teenager who didn't know the true God and was therefore justly punished in his perspective now as an old Christian bishop for having disobeyed their teachings. He says at the time that he was captured as a youth, nay, almost as a boy, unable to speak, I was taken captive before I knew what to pursue and what to avoid. Hence today, he says, I blush and I fear exceedingly to reveal my lack of education, for I'm unable to tell my story to those versed in the art of concise writing, in such a way, I mean, as my spirit and mind long to do, and so that the sense of my words expresses what I feel. So although in his letter here, Patrick expresses humility due to like a lack of education, a rustic background, he is able to write himself in Latin, as he says, and this is probably not his primary language. He's probably a second language, with some British Celtic language being his primary language, and then having learned Irish and Irish Celtic languages as he later in life as he evangelizes the Irish. So although again, this decurion class was not on par with the senatorial elite at the capitals, it was the declining empire's local elite, and so Patrick and his family had a bunch of status anyway, and that was evaporating. Living as an enslaved person in Ireland brought the young Patrick to religion. He says, after I came to Ireland, every day I had to tend sheep. So his owner, the person who is enslaving him, sets him up as a shepherd for him. And while he's doing it, many times a day I prayed. The love of God and his fear came to me more and more, and my faith was strengthened, and my spirit was moved so that in a single day I would say as many as 100 prayers, and almost as many in the night, and this even when I was staying in the woods and on the mountains. I used to get up for prayer before daylight, through snow, through frost, through rain. It's more than a mailman here, all the different devotions to it. And I felt no harm, and there was no sloth in me, as I now see, because the spirit within me was then fervent. So even though he is enslaved and he's being a shepherd, he's also sort of a he's on a pattern of self-asceticism here, where he's effectively almost being like a monk in the desert, as he's being a person who's given over to prayer and asceticism, no matter what the conditions around him in this foreign land that he finds himself in. Then, when he was in his early 20s, he says he began receiving revelations. So one night, I heard in my sleep a voice saying to me, "It is well that you fast. Soon you will go to your own country." And again, after a short while, I heard a voice saying to me, "See, your ship is ready." And it was not near, but at a distance of perhaps 200 miles, and I had never been there, nor did I know a living soul there. And then I took flight, and I left the man with whom I had stayed for 6 years, so the person who had enslaved him, and I went in the strength of God, who directed me to my good, and I feared nothing until I came to that ship. So as a runaway, Patrick finally arrives at this port and finds a ship that he believed had been promised to him, but the captain initially refuses Patrick passage on the ship, even though Patrick apparently has money to pay for the voyage. He got somewhere. And while Patrick retires then again to go pray in this little hovel where he's been staying at the port, one of the sailors from the ship shout to him, "Oh, right, it's all right, you can come with us after all and be our companion." So the captain and his crew are pagans, as Patrick calls them, so not Christians. And after 3 days, they cross the sea from Ireland to a deserted or wasted part of Great Britain, where they leave the ship or they're shipwrecked. In any event, they're forced to scout around for food and supplies. And so Patrick says, for 28 days, we traveled through deserted country. And they, the whole group of them, lacked food, and the hunger overcame them. And so the next day, the captain said to me, "Tell me, Christian, you say that your God is great and all-powerful. Why then do you not pray for us? As you can see, we are all suffering from hunger. It is unlikely indeed that we shall ever see a human being again." And I said to them in full confidence, "Be truly converted with all your heart to the Lord my God, because nothing is impossible for him, that this day he may send you food on your way until you be satisfied, for he has abundance everywhere." So they're like, "Okay, I'm willing to try for that because I'm pretty hungry here." So once they all convert, then suddenly a hot herd of wild boars appears, as Patrick says, with the help of God, which all of the captain and the shipmates all kill for food. And then for the whole rest of the time, until they find people again, they're satisfied their needs. This really impresses all the former pagans. Patrick obviously has big pull with the man upstairs, and so they decide, to follow and become Christians. Eventually, Patrick makes it home. So he says, "After a few years, I was in Britain with my people, who received me as their son, and sincerely besought me that now at last, having suffered so many hardships, I should not leave them and go elsewhere. And there I saw in the night the vision of a man whose name was Victoricus, coming as if it were from Ireland, with countless letters. And he gave me one of them, and I read the opening words of the letter, which were, 'The voice of the Irish.' And as I read the beginning of the letter, I thought that at the same moment I heard their voice, for they were those beside the wood at Falkland, which is near the Western Sea, And thus did they cry out with one mouth, "We ask you, boy, come and walk among us once more." So this is Patrick's autobiographical account of his own calling. And I feel like in contrast to, kind of the later hagiographies where people are just very easily, raising the dead or transmuting things or all kinds of other things are happening, these kinds of experiences like having you're in the wilderness and suddenly you encounter a flock of or a herd of wild boars, these are more in keeping with real life experiences than the kind of literary miracles that come into legends when you're writing them later. In addition, I think that, his sense of revelation that he describes here, voices and visions in his dreams, those are also believable as personal experiences. But in any event, he describes this as his sense of calling to become a missionary in Ireland. And this is possibly also inspired by, he's probably been reading the book of Acts. A similar vision is recorded in the book of Acts where people call on Paul and his companions to come and convert the people in Europe in Macedonia. So although Patrick says that he might have preferred to go on living among his own people in Britain, and he also really longed to go visit the saints in Gaul and study there, he was driven by this sense of calling to return to Ireland, where he then labors to build up the Christian community for the whole rest of his life. So he's actively engaged in his episcopate, his laborious episcopate he calls it, but at some point his activities were questioned by other Christian leaders in Ireland, and they may be people who feel like he's acting maybe without proper authorization. We don't really know. That's my speculation. So he says, "I was attacked by a number of my seniors," in other words, other Christian leaders, "who came forth and brought up my sins against my laborious episcopate." So they're questioning something, bringing him up on charges and wanting to investigate what he's been doing in the bishopric that he claims to have. So Patrick doesn't specify what those charges were, but a significant portion of this confessio, this declaration that he's making, he spends denying that that he was ever charged anybody for any money for performing baptisms, ordinations, other spiritual services. He denies taking money for almost anything. So maybe they're charging him with enriching himself or selling sacraments or something. So he says, "When I baptized so many thousands of people, did I perhaps expect from any of them as much as half a scruple? Obviously not. Tell me if you know of such a thing, and I will restore it to you. Or when the Lord ordained clerics everywhere through my unworthy person, and I conferred the ministry upon them free, if I asked any of them as much as the price of my shoes, speak against me, and I will return it to you." So he's saying, I never charged for any of those things. So all these charges, if those are what the charges are, I'm innocent. Patrick's declaration, his confessio, does include his own formulation or creed explaining the Trinity. So we talked about his famous association with teaching the Trinity using shamrock, but his actual writing doesn't include that analogy. And because I think it's interesting that he has his own formulation that's not the same as any of the formal creeds like the Nicene Creed, we might read it. So he says, "Because there is no other God, nor ever was, nor will be, than God the Father, unbegotten, without beginning, from whom is all beginning, the Lord of the universe, as we have been taught. There is no God other than him and his Son, Jesus Christ, whom we declare to have always been with the Father, spiritually and ineffably begotten by the Father before the beginning of the world," so before time itself, "before all beginning. And by him," Jesus Christ, "all things are made, all things visible and invisible. He," Jesus Christ, "was made man, and having defeated death, was received into heaven by the Father, and he has given him all power over all names in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue shall confess to him that Jesus Christ is Lord and God, in whom we believe, and whose advent we expect soon to be, judge of the living and of the dead, who will render to every man according to his deeds. And he has poured forth upon us abundantly the Holy Spirit, the gift and pledge of immortality, who makes those who believe and obey sons of God and joint heirs with Christ. And him do we confess and adore, one God in the Trinity of the holy name. So that's how Patrick describes the Trinity. So that would have been acceptable, although they might not understand it still since he didn't use an analogy. So it doesn't match any of the official creeds, like I say. It's sort of a personal hybrid creedal statement, and it's come to be called the Irish Creed of the Trinity, taken from this Confession of Patrick. So these two brief texts we have from Patrick himself, I think, give us a really rare, seemingly realistic glimpse into Britain at the time of the collapse of Western imperial authority, and also of the active, ongoing conversion of Irish and other Celtic peoples to Christianity from the worship of old gods, their old gods. Nevertheless, even though we immediately see when a person is writing their own account, this is going to be closer to history than a hagiography written, let's say, a century or many centuries later that gets into fanciful miracles and so forth. We nevertheless, by having Patrick's writing himself and nothing else, we only have his own account, which is, of course, always self-serving. We always are writing from our own perspective and biases. And so when we're trying to understand this, we are forced as historians to then decide, well, how much of what Patrick is saying do we trust him? Do we believe him? Or how much of that is consistent with the rest of the historical record as we know it? So you can take that, you can take it, that we believe a lot of what he's saying and it seems credible, or you can read into the source and question what he's actually saying. And so one of those re-examinations that's come out fairly recently is by a professor of early medieval history at University College Dublin, Roy Fletchner, who questions Patrick's account of his abduction into slavery. So it's definitely something that happened, that kind of thing happens. In other words, in the final years of Rome's administration, people were being abducted, but being a decurion, as we mentioned, like Patrick says his father was, that was an expensive and onerous role, and there were lots of people in the last centuries of the Western Roman Empire who tried to get out of it. So normally if you were of the decurion class, your children, your sons had to maintain that, and they had to also join the decurion councils, pay for all of the administrative things of the empire and so on. And so as people tried to escape those burdens, they tried to abscond and not be decurions anymore. So historians call this the flight of the curialis class. So while clearly various raiders were capturing and enslaving people in the 5th century, that part is the idea that Patrick got captured and enslaved isn't the problem. Fletchner, though, finds Patrick's story of his escape from slavery and making his way across some 200 miles of Ireland and also having money to buy passage to Britain, plus then landing in wilderness and finding the wild boars. He finds that part of the story less plausible and suggests maybe Patrick was fleeing decurion class responsibilities, which he later then reinterprets or claims that he had this period of being a slave and so forth. So was Patrick sold into slavery, as he says? It's very difficult to know because we have only his own words on it. Now let's turn to another issue in terms of the tradition of Patrick, the idea that he was the apostle to the Irish. So Patrick doesn't actually make that claim. This is part of later tradition that derives from the different hagiographies. And we do have some contemporary texts, contemporary to Patrick, that have a different tradition of bringing Christianity to Ireland. So there is a man named Prosper of Aquitaine, who is a contemporary 5th century writer, who was also a disciple of Augustine of Hippo down in Africa, who Prosper wrote a continuation of St. Jerome's Universal Chronicle. So in addition to translating or retranslating the Bible from Greek into Latin, St. Jerome's Vulgate, another work that St. Jerome was working on was telling an entire kind of Christian history of the world from its supposed beginning in the Genesis stories all the way down to the present day. And so then after Jerome's chronicle leaves off, Prosper of Aquitaine is one of the first people to continue the chronicle so that he keeps the history up to date, and his period covered goes from 379 to 455. And so people assume, therefore, that Prosper probably died around the year 455 since he had been updating the chronicle up until that time. So Prosper talks about the first mission to Ireland and what he thinks of as his first bishop. So Prosper's Chronicon states that in the year 431, a person named Palladius, having been ordained by Pope Celestine I, as that would be, is sent as first bishop to the Scotti, believing in Christ. And so for the Romans, Scotti refers not only to the Scots in Scotland, but also the Scots in Ireland, so the Gaelic speakers. And so Palladius then is sent by Celestine I to be the first bishop to Ireland in 431. And then for the year 433, in the Chronicle, Prosper records, having ordained a bishop for the Irish, while he labors to keep the Roman island Catholic, he has also made the barbarian island Christian. And so, this idea then Palladius being sent on a mission from the Pope has not only made the barbarian island, that is to say, of the two islands in the British Isles, the island Ireland, the barbarian island, he made that one Christian, and he worked on trying to keep the Roman island Catholic, that is to say, Great Britain. So what was happening there was pagan Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were coming from the northern part of the continent, from what's now Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, in order to displace and colonize the eastern parts, what becomes England, of the island of Britain. So when they arrive, they are not Christians. And so this Bishop Palladius is working on both of those projects. So writing in the next century, around the year 613, to Pope Boniface IV, an Irish monk named Columbanus credited Ireland's conversion to that work of the papacy. So he alludes, therefore, to the mission of Palladius and is ignoring Patrick if he thinks that the local tradition is that Patrick was the earliest. So it may not be clear that was the tradition, although by the end of the 7th century, there are two hagiographers who have recorded what I consider to be very adventurous saint lives for Patrick, and that begins kind of the popularization of his legends. And so in those saints' lives, Patrick is, having, fun, essentially wizards' duels with druids and so forth, things that contradict also things that Patrick writes in his own letters, so they've already diverged a lot from a historical Patrick. And some scholars think that over time, some of these saints' lives and the legends of things about Patrick kind of end up not only displacing Palladius's memory, but maybe, incorporating some of the things that Palladius might have done with Patrick and essentially conflating them into a single founder legend. But it's one possibility. So all of this, therefore, I think is some of the very interesting window into this period of the collapse, but also of Roman survival amid that collapse. So the office of emperor in the West disappeared, along with military authority, so that instead devolves onto the leaders of the different Germanic confederations who became kings in their own different realms, the kingdoms of the Suevi, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians, and ultimately the Franks, as they took over and displaced, and also in the north, when people coming from who had not been converted to Christianity, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes displacing Romano-Britons. So nevertheless, even as all of that is happening and it changes our map very remarkably, lots of the functioning continues on. Many of the Roman cities all continue to function, even if they contract to be much smaller than they had been. Many of the systems continue, and much of Romanitas, what it is to be Roman, survives. People still think of themselves as being Romans, and they don't immediately say, oh, this was the year Rome fell. That's something that we look at in retrospect and have identified in the modern era, Rome's fall, as opposed to what they felt and experienced at the time. And so, for example, one of the major survivals of Rome is the survival of its state religion. So much of what Christianity is just an inheritance of the Romans. So, for example, we think of basilica, the word basilica, that's an ecclesiastical building and essentially means church. And when we look at a church, we think of that. Well, the church, this basilica, the form began as a Roman administrative structure that had various uses for Roman civic government. It was churches that later made use of an existing Roman structure. And so, for example, this amazing, vast basilica that survives in Trier in Germany, one of the West's capitals along the military frontier at the Rhine against the Germanic confederations, this to us looks like a church, and it survived because it became a church, but it was an audience palace for the emperor when he held court at the western frontier. Words like diocese, if you think of diocese, that thinks of that as an ecclesiastical jurisdiction, but it initially refers to an administrative unit of the empire. Latin, of course, survives the Middle Ages as an administrative language, as Roman officials continued to use that. So beneath the Germanic kings, all of the people that are writing and who are doing administration, they continue to use Latin as a language of administration, and they continue to staff those positions. And even as some of those are displaced by Germanic officials, Romans continued to staff the offices of the church hierarchy, which again had become one with the state since there was no separation of church and state in the late Roman Empire. As Patrick noted when he was talking about the Franks, the Roman nobles who had previously staffed both those civic and ecclesiastical offices continued to serve as important church authorities in Gaul and throughout the Latin West. Many of these then retreated from the temporal world, as Patrick was denigrating Coroticus for worrying about some kind of temporal fleeting world, worldly dominion that's going to be like dust and blow away, when he should be thinking of that which is eternal. Many of these Roman senatorial elite people and others would convert their villas into monasteries, and indeed this whole form that we think of as a medieval cloister is itself based on what a Roman villa would have been like. And so within those monasteries, classical culture was studied, preserved as the texts and everything, but both pagan inheritance and also Christian inheritance were maintained. So crazily, we think of this as a period, like I say, of collapse and fall and decline and all this kind of thing, but counterintuitively, it's actually only in the centuries after the conquest of a place like Roman Gaul by warriors who initially spoke Germanic tongues like Frankish and Visigothic and Burgundian. It's only though once they conquer Gaul that Latin finally exterminates Celtic languages outside of Brittany, which is repopulated by Roman Britons. And so that little part that sticks out of what's now France continued to have, a Celtic language, although not the native Gallic one, but one that was brought in from Britain. So it combined. The rest of the pockets of Celtic language were slowly suppressed and taken over after the Roman Empire fell. So people switched to speaking, a vernacular version of Latin, what ultimately becomes the different composite tongues of French. There's the French, as we now have it, is the Parisian French, but there had been all kinds of different dialects of vernacular Latin, Frankish French. Similarly, so when the Romans conquered, Caesar conquered Gaul and incorporated it into the empire, Roman authorities suppressed the religion of the Celts, the Druids, the Druidic hierarchies. But Celtic paganism, the gods of the Celts and so on, continued through a kind of syncretism with Greco-Roman religions, and so Celtic gods were understood to be the same as Mars or Mercury or Venus and so forth. And that also continued until after the fall of the West, and it's only in the centuries after the Western Roman emperors ceased to exist that all the last pockets of Celtic paganism in Gaul are stamped out and they convert to Christianity. So it's sort of counterintuitive that we would think that, okay, with the empire gone, things are going to go back or there'll be more chaos, not that this kind of powers of conformity will continue on and things will get more Latin or more Christian, but that's actually what happens. So rather than collapsing with some of the other components of the state, therefore, the Latin Church actually expanded in the 5th and 6th centuries, the kind of time that we really think of as the Dark Ages, as popes like Celestine I, as we saw in 431, sent missions to places like Ireland that had never been Roman, or a century and a half later, when Pope Gregory I in 595 sent a mission to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxon realms that had displaced the eastern half and eastern 3/4 of Roman Britain. A guy named Augustine, like I say, we call him Augustine of Canterbury because he makes his church there after converting King Ethelbert of Kent in 597. So Kent is the southeast corner of England, and Canterbury is the capital of Kent, and that becomes the seat of the first archbishop, this mission sent by Gregory. So independent efforts by zealous locals like Patrick were likely even more effective than these official programs from Rome. And so on the one hand, locals are zealously converting other locals, and once people are converted, so for example, once the Irish are converted during the 5th century, they themselves become the missionaries. As we saw, Irish missionary Columba led a mission to the northern Pictish kingdoms. He and 12 companions founded a monastery at Iona, which became a center for their activities, and slowly then the kind of Celtic church is reconverting all of Britain, or actually converting, because they wouldn't have all been converted at the time of the collapse, while simultaneously from the bottom southeast to there, Canterbury, the Roman missions are converting from the other direction, coming together and expanding Christianity. So this led to some distinctive Irish developments because unlike Italy, Gaul, or even Britain, Christianity in Ireland had lacked a previous Roman foundation. So everything that's going on in Gaul is kind of Roman remains continuing and sort of redoubling and refounding their efforts. And so the Irish cultural context, which was very different indeed, caused the church there to develop distinctives like the Celtic cross with the circle that is representing presumably an inheritance from an earlier Irish understanding of the eternal, and that is then superimposed on the cross to make a really beautiful symbol. And the other part of it is because Romanitas was so focused on cities, and it's just something that didn't exist in Ireland and Pictland and so forth, the northern part of Britain, the church had to function in a different way, a way that isn't about a focus on cities. And so since each city in Christianity was led by a bishop, just the same way there was a Roman civic official that was leading the city's civic administration, in early medieval Ireland, the monastic centers, the abbots, were actually developed as more powerful since the bishops didn't really have a big civic base. And since people like Patrick, who were so influential, as he was even describing his own spiritual path, it was more influenced by asceticism and monasticism. And so monasticism became so much more important within Irish Christianity. And in some cases, including in Patrick's own foundation at Armagh, the abbot would be the top official and would have actually a bishop who would be part of the monastery who would sort of report to the abbot and so on. So this importance of monasteries and the Isles ended up getting re-exported back to continental Europe once the Frankish kingdom got really well established in what had been Gaul. And this includes a monk who's different from Columbanus, who spent the last decades of his life on the continent founding really important abbeys in France and Francia and Burgundy and Italy. And monks, Irish monks following in his wake, ultimately ended up founding over 200 abbeys, which reinforced classical learning and a focus on that within kind of the continental empire, which is where the claim comes that that the Irish saved civilization, because this Irish monasticism included a focus on schools, on relearning Latin, recopying texts, and so forth. So sometimes it's almost portrayed as if the Celtic Church was like a unified church in opposition to the church in Rome or something like that. It's in fact never, Celtic Christianity is never one unified thing, and indeed sometimes it might make more sense to even talk about an insular Christianity, since what's going on between Ireland and what became Scotland and what becomes the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Wales and so forth, they're all interacting with each other and creating a distinctive style. And it also, of course, because they are so isolated from Rome in a time when travel is so difficult and so on, they develop different distinct customs. So, for example, the Roman Church for monks had a special way of tonsuring monks where they would shave their heads, which is not how, whereas I think the Celtic or insular Christians would grow their hair long and things. So they would have different traditions like that. The most important distinction is the calculation of Easter. We've had whole lectures about how important this was for early Christians. Essentially, the idea is that Easter is the most important holiday in the whole Christian calendar, but unlike St. Patrick's Day, Easter is a movable feast. And so in other words, you have to do some astronomical calculations in order to figure out exactly when Easter falls in any given year. And what had essentially happened was the insular churches in Ireland and the north and so forth, Northern Britain, had all continued to use an older calculation than the updated calculation that had been done in Rome and spread around since then. And so as a result, they were having Easter on different days. And that not only affects Easter, it affects all of Lent. So 40 days before Easter, Mardi Gras, Ash Wednesday, and so forth. And then it also, all the holidays afterwards, leading 50 days afterwards to Pentecost. So you're doing the whole Christian calendar at different times. And so ultimately, this different calculus came into conflict with all of those Irish monasteries on the continent, which eventually had to adopt the Roman calculus, as did then the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, where in Northumbria, one of the northernmost anyway of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the king held a synod at a town called Whitby. This is the ruins of the abbey there, and heard both sides and ended up determining that Northumbria was going to go ahead and follow the Roman calculus. And so those kind of traditions, essentially over time, the different customs were reintegrated with the continent, sometimes forcibly, sometimes just over time as there's more connections with them. But nevertheless, within that, these the different both zealous Irish monks who did so much to reestablish monasticism played nevertheless a very important role within the growing church at the post-Roman fringe. And so that was my look at St. Patrick and then some of the legacies that came from his conversion and his conversion of the Irish. Natural Philosophy, thank you so much for your support. Ice Gator says, in your research, did you find any influences on Patrick? In other words, are there Gaulish or other bishops, or whether Augustine of Hippo's Trinitarian ideas had reached Gaul, Britain, Ireland? So, as I was looking at it, so we read Patrick's own formulation of teaching the Trinity. And so in contrast to the 18th century and more newer legends where that it has Patrick essentially using a shamrock to teach it, which is not a good analogy, as we've said, Patrick's own formula, while it doesn't, he's not just quoting the Nicene Creed, he's saying it in his own way. As I read that, and as we read it just now again, that seems to be completely orthodox. So the Trinitarian ideas that had been kind of hammered out in Nicaea and Chalcedon, the later councils, that then also, Augustine is just a little bit earlier, or that same kind of time period, talking about at greater length, that Trinitarianism has already reached Patrick, who is then sharing that with the people he's writing to. David Latorre says, can we really be certain that this slave story is true? In other words, the idea that Patrick was taken to Ireland enslaved and then freed himself. So we can't, right? So like I was saying, we have Patrick's own words that he's telling his own story, and so it's autobiographical. And so whenever we have a sole source, we have to look at, you essentially look at the source. To what extent do we think that what they're saying is credible? How much is that consistent with what we know of the historical record? And like I was saying, we have a scholar who has really questioned that and has provided an alternate explanation for why Patrick might have fled his homeland, this idea that he was trying to escape Decurion responsibilities that would have potentially, bankrupted him and would have been very onerous and so on. And so he's maybe using that to describe what otherwise might have been a wayward period of his life before he found God and became where he is. So I'm not sure that I believe that alternate explanation more. I'm sort of, I sort of feel like getting captured and enslaved is something that happens like a lot at this time period. But the complicated part is him getting away. On the other hand, he's maybe owned by a guy in Ireland who is a little bit of a landholder who has a bunch of flocks of sheep, but isn't. If you're out having a enslaved person as your shepherd in a distant hill somewhere, he might be able to run away more easily without getting recaptured. So who knows? It's a credible story, but we can't know it's true. Fred Church, thank you for your support. Roxanne Gano says, I've heard the driving out the snakes was a metaphor for driving out the pagans, the old religion of the Celts. So absolutely, you can whenever you have something that's a legend, you can, that didn't happen. You could also then read something meaningfully, and you can say it's like a metaphor, and that's certainly a way that that can be interpreted. I was just explaining that, we're looking at the evidence of it, that it isn't actually even a story that's first associated with Patrick. So this is one thing that happens a lot of times. A great story that somebody is associated with somebody, a lesser hero, let's say Columba in this case, then gets associated with a more important hero because the story is so good. And so whether or not, like you say, it's meant literally, which obviously it's not literally true, but then it's read meaningfully or metaphorically. In other words, that this is converting the pagans. It gets it gets assigned to Patrick, and it has that kind of meaning then. Anders and Lister, thank you so much for your support. Pythagorean Metronome says, can you say something about how Catholics always localize to their particular population? St. Patrick seems like the Irish version of Mexico's Our Lady of Guadalupe. So yeah, I think that, so one of the things that has happened, so when we're having in both cases we call this Catholic, but we can also say that this is the entire Roman Christian Church at the time of Patrick, right? So there hasn't been this later schism, East and West, or the later schism between what we now think of as Catholic and Protestant. This is simply what's going on with the spread of Christianity post becoming a state religion. And so one of the things that has happened in that context is relating the ideas, kind of there's a central idea of how the Trinity works, and there's some other like kind of core ideas, but then there's other things that are less essential, or where you can make use of pre-existing concepts, symbols, places, and so on without it detracting. And so, for example, with the mission that Pope Gregory the Great sends to the Anglo-Saxons that Augustine leads, he writes it back and says, it's perfectly fine for you to go to a pagan and Anglo-Saxon temple, chop down the statue of the god, rechristen it as a church, and if all the same old ladies keep coming, like they would have come to the pagan cult, and now they come and are there and are calling upon the saints to help them with the same kind of things that they would have sought help from a god before, then that's fine. So Pope Gregory was quite pragmatic about that kind of thing. And so, yeah, what seems to have happened is that, there were some, existing Irish, distinctives in their version of the old religions that get pulled into and adopted, within the incarnation of Christianity that emerges from the synthesis that Patrick has. I mean, it's not a system where we have some kind of like perfect modern program like exists today, and you just have to throw everything else away. Patrick wasn't coming with anything when he's on his mission. He certainly wouldn't have had a whole Bible. He would have had, some writings, a couple things, but he would hardly have anything other than, what he himself knows and the kind of testimony that he can give and that sort of thing. And so then that would evolve into, like I say, in the context, a different kind of Christianity than you'd find in a different place, especially in the rest of the post-Roman world, which Ireland is outside of, since you don't even have this kind of civic structure where you would plant bishops in a place like Ireland. So it would make it different. And same thing then happened in the New World, where Europeans encountered people that are just completely outside of the tradition that they've had before and hardly know how to place them within their relatively limited worldview of understanding what's even going on. And so And so in meeting and interacting with, a lot of cases killing a whole bunch of people, enslaving them, unfortunately, and all the other things that happened in the colonization, a lot of cases the church leaders, while wanting to stamp out any native religious practices, nevertheless were oftentimes more advocates for bringing the people in as part of the new body, expanded body of Christ, and so therefore they end up with a synthesis that also happens as native peoples become Christians in a new context in their own lands. Edgar Hans, now knows as Edgar Horth. Edgar Horth, okay, anyway. So Edgar Horn says, I may have blanked, but did John get to whether Patrick is officially canonized as a saint? He is absolutely canonized officially as a saint, yes. So he has I often, when I'm talking about people, I don't always say Saint Augustine. I often say Augustine of Hippo, and I talk about them more as a historical figure rather than worrying about them as a saint in one of the different church traditions, but Patrick is definitely a saint officially. Rachel Kokor says, why do the Scottish people not have a prominent relationship to St. Patrick when historically there are vast connections to the nation with Northumbria and allegedly his birthplace? So yeah, some people have identified, we said that village that Patrick says that he's from. So since we can't identify it for sure where it is in Britain, some people have suggested that it might be in what's now Scotland. And so maybe Patrick is from there. And then also what's now Scotland, half of the kingdom of Northumbria, the area of Lothian, essentially the lowlands to the east, above Newcastle and all the way up to getting close to Edinburgh. That area was part of Northumbria, and it got incorporated into the Kingdom of Scotland. So there is that heritage as well within what's now Scotland. But I think that not having a prominent relationship to St. Patrick, I think that that part of the prominence of St. Patrick is actually because he's associated with Irish identity, and so I think that they might have had more prominence they might have had more interest in St. Patrick. Medieval people in what's now Scotland might have had a lot more interest in St. Patrick and a bunch of other saints. But in modern times, as the nationalities have created their own national identity stories, Ireland fixed on Patrick, and Scotland created its own picked its own national historical figures to rally around and create a picture of their own national identity. So I think that's why. You could also ask, if Patrick might have been from England too. What's now England? Obviously, the English weren't there in the part of England where Patrick lived. They might have just been coming in on the other side. Ice Skater says, do you think that Patrick's writing has any theological relevance for you to modern Christians outside of the issue of the Trinity? I thought it was I think that kind of a story that he has of, when he's in this place and, he's got a rich father and grandfather who are also important people in a church and so on, but, he's maybe like a pastor's son or a bishop's brat or something like that. So in other words, he doesn't care about any of that stuff as somebody who's just grown up within it in his background. And he just doesn't think of it as important. And then he has terrible hardship happen to him. So as he describes it and as he presents it anyway, he's enslaved. He's captured with 1,000 people and brought to Ireland and has this completely alien environment outside of what he understood the universe to be, the Roman Empire. And really when he comes back, he's at a certain point now living amid collapse. So even though, he talks about, well, maybe I could have just stayed among my people. Well, that's all breaking apart anyway. And so he finds something important in spiritual practice. He finds himself in the divine during hardship, and that gives him, kind of a life's purpose as these people that he's kind of forced to have come and lived within or live under, and then he later, decides he wants to make them his people in the way he understands what's important. And so I think that's that kind of a personal conversion story is very believable, understandable, and still has, I think, a lot of relevance today. So yeah. All right, folks. This was a fun one, I thought. I actually had not read either of these two documents that we have from Patrick before. I mostly knew about him through the sort of hagiographies and the legends and so forth. So it was fun to do. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you. Next week, we're going to talk about Christian mysticism, ancient practices. And of course, we always love it if you like and share the video, subscribe to our channel. And of course, we appreciate your support with donations, which you can always do at our website, centerplace.ca/donate. Thanks again.